Without further ado, I'm going to introduce our keynote speaker for this morning. Professor Susan Kemp is Professor of Social Work at the University of Auckland, New Zealand, and the Charles O. Cressy Endowed Professor Emeritus at the University of Washington School of Social Work, Seattle. Her research interests focus on place, environment, and community, marginalized children, youth and families, and social work history and theory. She is co-author of Person Environment Practice, The Social Ecology of Interpersonal Helping, and co-editor of The Paradox of Urban Space, Inequality, and Transformation in Marginalized Communities, and Communities, Neighborhoods, and Health, Expanding the Boundaries of Place. The hallmarks of her work include an emphasis on working across disciplinary, theoretical, and methodological borders and strengthening social work's transdisciplinary research capacity. A fellow of the American Academy of Social Work and Social Welfare, she is a national co-lead of the US Grand Challenge for Social Work, Create Social Responses to a Changing Environment. A really warm welcome to the conference, Susan, and I will hand over to you now. So the floor is yours.
Thank you, Natalia. And do give me that 5-minute warning.
I will do, I will.
Okay, thank you. Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Greetings to all of you from Aotearoa, New Zealand, and specifically from Tamaki Makaurau, Auckland, where I acknowledge and recognize with gratitude Ngāti Whātua Ōrākei, the indigenous Māori people of this land. My appreciation also to Heather Lynch and Tina Wilson, co-organizers of this exciting conference, for the invitation to join this conversation and to offer some framing remarks. Global dialogues such as these, I think, are really critical to the vitality and relevance of social work as a profession and as a discipline, and have never been more so than at this point in time. Although I was thinking today, for those of, I know there's Caroline, for example, is a historian as well, and thinking of other times where the profession has convened itself, often around national borders, however, to rethink itself at times of trouble and struggle. I have minimal PowerPoints for this. I've decided just to mostly have a script, so I apologize if you're used to having lots of anchoring points. But I'm going to just dive in. The frame for the conference invites us to consider two linked but potentially conflictual questions. What social work does the world need now? And what might be social work futures? In this presentation, I offer some preliminary thoughts on the implications for our field of these interlocking imperatives. As Heather has noted, the fierce agony of now, the upheavals and pressing demands locally and globally, which have come with a global pandemic, in tandem with the equally and increasingly important need for social work to look ahead and consider where it might or should be positioned going forward. Current challenges and uncertainties heighten the desire politically, socially, and at the level of lived lives for quick answers, and all too frequently for techno-scientific solutions. Given the profound impact of the pandemic on societies in general, and human well-being in particular, our preoccupation with meeting immediate challenges is unsurprising. From a social work perspective, furthermore, the profession's mandate to respond to what is in front of it in human terms simply cannot be sidestepped. Globally, people and communities are suffering, particularly those for whom social work feels most responsible. The pandemic, as we are all very well aware, has laid bare in profound ways fault lines of poverty and wealth, marginality and privilege. In this context, the immediate understandably feels and is incredibly pressing. People and communities are stretched and struggling, and social workers and social services are stretched and struggling alongside of them. Pressures to respond to current needs as effectively as possible are palpable and inescapable, including, I might add, in our universities. At the same time, mindful of and grateful for Tom Grimwood's, and I noticed Tom's on the call, caution that in the context of 21st century liberalism, a sense of urgency already saturates the profession. It has not just arrived with the pandemic. Indeed, Tom reminds us that it has become an inherent feature of social work, a persuasive rhetoric with significant implications for the shaping of contemporary social work practice, and which in particular gives power to problem-focused technical and bureaucratic responses, concomitantly delimiting opportunities for reflection and critique. As Tom notes, drawing on the work of post-colonial theorist Dipesh Chakrabarti, a sense of urgency, particularly in the context of crisis, can cut short thinking, forecasting, and foreclosing a sense of opportunity and the ability to imagine possible alternatives to current practice, both currently and also looking forward. We should be wary, therefore, of the gravitational pull towards prioritizing near-term solutions over the longer-term view, seductive though that is. Stepping back for a moment from the complexities and challenges right in front of us, it is clear that while present-focused interventions are important and will always be part of social work's mandate, they are not in themselves sufficient. As Heather has just enumerated, the entangled wicked problems confronting global communities, climate change, poverty and inequality, homelessness, zoonotic diseases, are by definition complex, contingent, and intransigent. Global issues such as climate change and pandemics are also inherently unbounded and open-ended. Their trajectories and outcomes cannot fully be predicted. Increasingly, therefore, there is broad interdisciplinary agreement that adequately addressing these kinds of issues and anticipating the emergent, unpredictable challenges associated with them requires both immediate responses and a capacity to be forward-looking for transformational thinking and action within and across disciplines and professions. So how can or should social work position itself in relation to these realities? Can it, in fact, balance imperatives for responsiveness in the present, particularly in yet another austerity present, while at the same time fundamentally reorienting its knowledge systems and practices? I briefly explore these questions through the lens of arguably the most profound global challenge of the era, climate change and the interlocking socio-environmental challenges related to and contributing to it, including environmental injustice, urbanization, and environmental degradation. Unlike the pandemic, which abruptly, brutally, and almost overnight upended the world's operating instructions, the impacts of climate change have generally been gradual, cumulative, and distributed. Until recently, it has been a slow-moving crisis, diffuse, variable, and uncertain, hard to get one's head around, easy to set aside as not core business. Subject, in fact, to what Mark Carney, Governor of the Bank of England, has termed the tragedy of the horizon, tendencies to think that dealing with it can be put off or deferred to others. Social work has, in my view, been particularly culpable in this regard for all the profession's long expressed commitment to working at the person-environment interface. As a profession and as a discipline, social work has been curiously absent in interdisciplinary efforts to engage proactively with climate change and related issues. This despite the fact that it is increasingly clear that the profession's commitments, capacities, and deep knowledge of people in their local environmental contexts are sorely needed. As a field, my perspective, unlike Heather's, is that social work actually also tends to be resolutely presentist. We may think about futures, but typically in the near term. And in fact, we tend to have difficulty, as social work futurist Laura Nissen has argued, in moving to a truly forward-looking stance. Meanwhile, the need for transformative thinking and action on a global scale is increasingly clear. Julie Shea, founder of the Environmental Justice Project at the University of California, Davis, and professor of American Studies, describes the precarious environment we currently live in as a moment of danger. A toxic brew of climate change, global inequality, active assaults on democratic institutions, racism, and intensifying social, political, economic, and environmental injustices. Kerry Facer, a leading futurist now in Sweden, similarly points to a series of civilization disrupting shifts, pervasive fragility of the earth, of democracy, of prevailing social structures, the disproportional impact of these on marginalized and disadvantaged populations, and the devastating effects of non-linear crises such as the pandemic that ripple across deeply interconnected global environments. In this context, Facer asserts, one that has been described as fundamentally reinscribing the ontology of being human. Climate change cannot and must not be understood as only a problem to be solved. Rather, she calls for a, quote, civilizational and relational shift in our relationship with the planet, a shift that will require us collectively to play a long game, entailing fundamental changes on every level, from economic arrangements and the conditions for democracy to the knowledges, practices, and taken for granted touchstones and rituals of professions such as ours. So in relation to social work, I'm actually hopeful that needed changes may at last get more traction. The urgencies of our present moment and the social fractures these have made visible have, I think, created a window of opportunity for significant amplification of emerging pathways for transforming social work knowledges, practices, and capacities. Not only is the greater public awareness that transformative change is vital, that business as usual simply won't suffice, but we've actually been presented with proof of concept that it is possible, in that exigencies of the pandemic have prompted an array of actually surprisingly nimble and innovative social and economic responses at the grassroots and local communities, for sure, but also from apparently rigid and rule-bound social systems. It's been rather surprising to see what the university even can do in a pinch in the pandemic. However, if as a profession we are to engage with this opportunity and contribute to change that is sustainable and not just short term, we must engage seriously with Facer's key question. How do we build sturdy, as she says, jetties to the future, given that we and our students and the communities we serve are all, quote, moving into a new world for which we have no maps? Looking across the writers, thinkers, and actors in this space, including in social work, the contours of an agenda for crafting durable jetties to the future are beginning to emerge. Contours that I know will be reiterated and given specificity by a number of the presentations in this conference, and in fact, by a number of the people currently sitting with us. And they will be familiar, I think, to many of you. Verena, if we could just have the second slide. I've suddenly got presenter view and I can't tell what I'm looking at. So not the critical bifocality one, the one about the contours. Thanks a lot. So these are things that you will find familiar, but when you look at this agenda and these conversations from the vantage point, for example, of environmental and climate sciences, they begin to look a little more surprising as well as a little more optimistic. The first, I would argue, is that there is a rapidly emerging conversation about reclaiming and recentering the social and discussions around climate change and climate justice. There's widespread and growing recognition that climate change, like the pandemic, is inescapably a human and social crisis, and that going forward, adequate responses to it require both a moral imagination and joined up holistic socio-ecological responses. At this point, I'm hearing a lot more on that topic, however, from sociologists and community psychologists, and indeed psychology, than I am from social work, except for those of us who have been trying to write and talk and think and research some of these issues. There is also an increasingly deliberative focus on social justice and equity. Again, both the pandemic and climate change make clearly visible the underlying fault lines and inequities in societies worldwide, underscoring the critical importance of justice and equity-oriented interventions, and adding fuel to conversations already underway about the intersections among climate change, environmental justice, environmental and institutional racism, and settler colonialism. Threaded with this is an emphasis on new and different partnerships and on co-creation and co-production. So across various of the disciplines engaged in climate change and global environmental change efforts, there is increasingly broad agreement that efforts to tackle wicked problems such as these require novel, indeed strange bedfellow partnerships in research, practice, and education, across disciplines and professions, undoubtedly, but also with local communities and stakeholders.
Just to let
For
you
social
know,
work, this...
Sorry, Susan, that's 5 minutes.
Thanks, Natalia. I'll speed up.
Sorry.
That's okay. For these partnerships to be feasible, it will, sorry, lost my place. So I'll just summarize that the importance, for example, for social work of a range of diverse partnerships with folk that we don't normally play with, frankly. Environmental, climate, and ecological sciences, the design professions, geography and urban planning, engineering and computer science, the environmental humanities, as well as community partnerships aimed at co-creating and co-producing frameworks informed by their local knowledges. I just wanted to add too that for these partnerships to be feasible, this is also going to entail thoroughgoing commitment to acknowledging, owning, and redressing social work's long complicity in practices and policies that historically and in the present have created and sustained the conditions placing Indigenous, minority, and other marginalized communities at greatest risk of harm. Fourth, there's broad recognition likewise of the importance of pluralistic knowledges and flattened knowledge hierarchies. Environmental issues necessarily illuminate the central importance of contextual knowledge and situated epistemologies. So our emerging socio-ecological frameworks, including those within sort of mainstream climate science and journals, increasingly emphasize deep engagement with real people in real places, including Indigenous knowledges, lifeways, and peoples. This is not, however, a matter of reworking extant by binaries, such that we reinsert local knowledges and marginalize Western science and technology. It's not my aim to sort of create another hierarchy here. Where would we all be without COVID vaccines, for example? Rather, I think they challenge the privileging of these knowledges over other knowledges and indeed sciences, and center more expansive holistic understandings of entangled relations between natural, social, and cultural worlds. Fifthly, these lead to much greater investments in locally tailored solutions and local action, and what I heard today called localism, which is perhaps a double-edged sword. So we see a re-engagement with and re-emphasis on community agency and self-determination, a growing commitment to the local, and recognition that in the context of climate change, the adaptability, resistance, and resilience of local communities and residents are key bulwarks to mitigating emerging threats and responding to the impacts of crises and disasters. All of these domains are remarkably syntonic with social work's mission and values. But I don't think we can rest on our laurels and rely on us just being able to bring to the table the things that we already have in place. More actively centering and engaging with these complexities requires us to actively cultivate as a field and in our students and in our social workforce the capacity. And here I thank Tina for bringing this framework to my attention. But Michelle Fine and Lois Weiss have termed it critical bifocality. Thanks, Verena. We'll get to that next slide, I think. Which can be thought of as a tolerance for embracing and working productively within and across the disparate, the complex, and the unfolding. A willingness to color outside the lines of our established social agencies, social work practices and frameworks, and indeed comfort zones, and an ability to hold and work with the tensions, but also opportunities that come with both and thinking and practice, including, among others, the ability to work in the moment and to anticipate, look forward. Deeply relational practices and frameworks that to me have to still be quintessentially human, but clearly and absolutely not human-centric, i.e. that they do not privilege human exceptionalism. And responses that are local and localized, but not parochial, which is why I struggle with that term localism, because we absolutely have to recognize, and the COVID pandemic has brought this home in remarkably profound ways, the local places and people are also stretchy, that here is also there. Looking and talking with one's international students brings that clearly home at the moment. And I am distributed across 2 countries, one of which I can't get to likewise. A willingness to engage in oh, next slide, thanks, Verena. We also have to build the capacity to engage and encompass diverse knowledges and knowledge holders, all the way from climate scientists and engineers to Indigenous and local community stakeholders. And to recognize that going forward, we are going to have to balance this drive towards certainty, the search for certainty, with the reality that the new normal is one of change, flux, and emergence. So the pandemic has taught us that we have lost the luxury of cross-sectional, relatively stable and precedentist approaches to social work practice, education, and research. We can no longer assume that tomorrow the world will mostly be pretty much as it is today. Indisputably, we have to think, teach, and practice for change. The challenges coming with climate change demand the capacity for agility, flexibility, creativity, and innovation. The stance that Nadan and colleagues from Australia describe as anticipative. We can no longer rely on legacy learning environments, in-person classroom teaching, for example, or long-standing theoretical and practice frameworks with their humanist individualist DNA. The skills for navigating changing environments and addressing environmental justices are in fact best developed through opportunities for developing praxis knowledge, through action, experimentation, the thinking of knowing, the cross-hatching of knowing and doing, and through pedagogical strategies such as design thinking, transdisciplinary engagement, and place-based learning and action. Critically inflected, praxis-oriented, participatory approaches also provide opportunities for holding our established knowledges and frameworks up for scrutiny in partnership with the people and communities we work with, and assessing the extent to which they're fit for purpose as we grapple with the changes and challenges we and those we serve are immersed in. Writing about the pandemic, Arundhati Roy points out that historically pandemics have forced humans to break with the past and imagine their world anew. This one is no different, she asserts. It is a portal, a gateway between one world and the next. Her core question, however, and the question I think today's conference will in part be grappling with, is whether we'll choose to walk through this portal, ready to imagine another world, as Arundhati Roy says, and ready to fight for it. Will we make the most of this liminal moment? Can we navigate the inevitable tensions and complexities that come with engaging and responding to the world we're in, at the same time imagining and working toward another? Can we find ways to imagine, invigorate, and expand our conceptual, methodological, and practice frameworks, and position social work as a forward-looking discipline of consequence in an increasingly contingent, unstable, and unsustainable world? I look forward with much anticipation and interest to the collective engagement with these and similar questions that mine and your participation in this conference will undoubtedly afford. Thank you. Thanks, Natalia. Sorry to go over a bit.
That's okay, that's okay. That was fascinating, Susan. Thank you so much for that contribution. That's a brilliant way to kick off today, I think. It was fantastic. So I suppose just to open it up to Q&A really for anyone out there. If you feel most comfortable typing questions in the chat box, that's absolutely fine. Or if otherwise, just unmute yourself and ask a question. That's absolutely fine as well. We've got quite a few minutes now just before the break. So if anyone wants to ask Susan a question, that would be fantastic. I'll just wait there to see some questions. I suppose from my perspective, Susan, I suppose I'm really interested in how you were talking there about social work being curiously absent really in these conversations, and how we can and should position ourselves within social work. I kind of look at social work's complicity within immigration. So I'm very much kind of interested in how that manifests within climate change as well, and why you think that social work is curiously absent as a profession, really.
I think I think partly we just don't see it as our core project. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Despite this long-standing definition of ourselves as a by-person environment or ecological frameworks or a commitment to people in place, however we want to think about that, that has been part of Western social work's legacy since the 1890s, and if not somewhat before. We've lost our way on a lot of the environmental justice work that the profession did in those early years, and have sort of reclaimed it since the 70s. But I think the turn to the personal and the humanistic that bedevils all of the conversations in this space. I'm looking at Karen Bell and thinking we'll hear more about that soon. But I think my former mentor at Columbia, Carol Meyer, said the profession made a wrong turn. And we've never found ourselves back at strange bedfellow interdisciplinary tables, even though actually when you do turn up, we're incredibly welcome at them. Transportation scientists and climate change scientists and atmospheric scientists don't know anything about the social. Mm-hmm. They'll put up sensors, they'll do their things, but they know that people are being hurt through environmental burdens and injustices. And they want partners in that enterprise of trying to think across this space. So through long experience, one of those books was written with an architect. The others are abundantly interdisciplinary apart from the first one. I just think there's a space we need to occupy, that we need to identify it as core business and think about how we reclaim the opportunity to bring what we know into those really, really important conversations. And it's starting to happen.
Yeah, I mean, I was thinking about how different innovative ways we might teach as well. Like when you said about thinking, teaching and practice with change, I found that really interesting, rather than just sticking to the kind of same normative ways that we teach. I think maybe there's different ways that we can I've got, I think I've got a question there from Social Work Futures.
I'll not get used to being Social Work Futures.
Hi, you are, Heather. I didn't know who it was.
Just because I'm logged on as this, it's strange. No, I was just thinking, thank you so much for your presentation, Susan. It makes loads of sense and really chimes with my own experience. And I guess kind of just following on from Natalia's question around how you do this work. I mean, I've always had interdisciplinary positions. I've worked within social policy, and I've worked within education, and social work's probably the most myopic discipline I've ever worked within, the hardest to sort of lift its head because it always seems to be in crisis mode. And I just wondered, you've obviously got experience of working in very different contexts, and I am super conscious as somebody based in Scotland who's interested in post-foundational thought and more than human thought, that there's a lot of interesting work that comes from the part of the world that you're working within just now. And I just wondered, do you think that it's more progressive? Do you think that these alliances are happening more readily there, or is that just it seems that way from where I'm sitting?
I think it's a work in progress, as it is in Canada and certainly in pockets of the US, and anywhere there are Indigenous peoples who are just really doing remarkable work to remind us of land dispossession and genocide and settler colonialism and the profound impacts of that extractive imperialist colonialist legacy that's ongoing. Certainly there's a real interest in New Zealand, and a growing one, in strategies that bridge the social and the environmental. I have seen recent work coming out of the Global South in Africa, and certainly India, that has that similar perspective. And it's not just community gardens, although those foodways are absolutely part of it, and food justice, but using healing practices of all kinds and placing them in conversation with trauma-informed care and other things.
So it's from that perspective, it's around how is the environment employed, or how are these ways of thinking employed in the social work task? Is that, or do you think it's
I think
more
so,
than that?
and it worries me that we sometimes develop a course and call it done. There's a lot of really good work coming out in the States in response to the mandate to include environmental justice, for example, but often it gets sort of bracketed on the sidelines yet again, rather than it being everybody's business. Some foregrounding these things more than others to work on these interlocking issues that are overturning the world, really.
I have a few more questions coming now, actually. So
Good. And I said, hopefully it can be this kind of conversation.
Okay, so I'm going to read out the first question for you. What is your perspective when there's part of the globe perceived that our current social work practices are focusing on Western perspectives instead of really highlighting on regional or local adaptation?
Great question. I hope that we can see increasing levels of investment in locally derived practices, models, and frameworks, with those becoming the center, and local peoples and academics, and in partnership with them, picking and choosing what they want from the West, but not having it at the center.
Okay, I've got one more question here. Okay, so current funding environments place considerable constraints on the imagination. How should social work as a profession go about creating spaces to reimagine itself and its contributions within the constraints of academic and practice work?
Yes. And even more austerity now, I think. Boy, I would love us to get our students more out into place and sort of start looking at more threading, where there's sort of absolutely limited opportunities for certain kinds of training and certain kinds of services, but also I think more opportunities than we think to build locally focused, environmentally focused work in and under the umbrella of some of the services that we have. I was just working in the south of New Zealand last week in an Indigenous-led or community organization, and was troubled by, we have really incredibly under-financed and under-resourced mental health system here, and high levels of trauma, historical, generational, and individual. And these workers were describing their inability to get people into services, but the construction of the services that they were providing, often which were place and community and healing based in nature, were being described as not mental health services, versus somehow that joined up idea has to start happening more, I think. And we're going to have to be incredibly creative. I think it was you, Dorothy, right, who put this question on the table, in how we do what we can with limited resources.
I think
I don't think it all has to happen in offices.
I think maybe we've got time for one. I've got one more raised hand, and then I'm just aware of time here. Is it Tom Grimwood there? Have you got a question?
Yes, thank you. And I've been sitting there trying to frame it, so I apologise if it doesn't come out right. I was just going to, and Susan kind of covered a lot of this already. I think something that I note around environmental aspects and climate change aspects is I mean, completely agree about the humanist turn and that focus on the individual. But there seems to be something about the way social work education is organised, where if we want to write a book on climate change, then it has to be called environmental social work, right? It can't just be a book on social work.
On social work.
Yeah. In the same way, we've got books on humanist social work. Well, all right, that's one thing. And it reminds me a little bit in philosophy where I come from, where it was you'd have modules on feminist philosophy, but like in all the other modules, there was presumably just gender equality. We didn't have to think about that then. It was just in those little modules that we all took as options. Yeah, exactly. So I suppose is climate change a different kind of concept? Is environmental, the way that social work has to use environment, a different concept compared to humanism, compared to person-centered? I suppose I'm just trying to think, and it's probably too big a question, certainly for the time it is in the UK. Is it possible to incorporate that just so it is just social work, or is that going to lose some of the nuances of the debate when we think about local and regional aspect, approaches?
Well, inevitably it's going to get chunked out, Tom, I think. But for me, it's not a course in environmental social work. It's actually centering and thinking about where you foreground it and where it actually is hugely important. Whatever the focus of the particular segment of education that you're looking at, it threads sort of this way and that way. If you're thinking child maltreatment, and you can start thinking about environmental justice and crappy houses and crappy places and what that means in terms of stress, burden, and trauma. And add to that a heat wave. I mean, my other home place, Seattle, which is temperate like New Zealand, is going to be 43 degrees Celsius or 109 degrees Fahrenheit tomorrow. And there's no air conditioning. It's not prepared for it. Older, poor people with burdens of chronic health issues are going to die unless they've got very good, very fast around cooling centers. So I can't think of a place where we couldn't bring it into the mix if we were thoughtful about it.